Who's to blame for African migrants being sold as slaves in Libya? European countries rushed to help Libyans get rid of Gaddafi, but quickly abandoned them. How can illegal migration be controlled in a failed state? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Video of slaves apparently being auctioned in Libya is causing widespread outrage. Politicians in Europe are keen to stem the flow of African refugees and migrants, but they often drown in the Mediterranean or are left stranded in transit countries like Libya, where they risk torture, rape and forced labour. The UN-backed government in Libya is promising to increase the number of flights repatriating stranded migrants. And the UN Security Council has held an emergency session to discuss people trafficking in Libya. Libya's ambassador to the United Nations is promising a full investigation into the slave auction video.
لقد تابعت بقلق بالغ ما تناقلته بعض التقارير الإعلامية.
I've issued directives to the specialized security bodies in order to authenticate the video recording. And if the recording is indeed authentic, then authorities will pursue the criminals and will present them to justice as soon as possible. We would also like to confirm that any violations against or mistreatment of illegal migrants are isolated and individual actions are not systemic at all.
Well, the French ambassador to the UN is calling for targeted sanctions against people traffickers.
Ce régime, créé par la résolution 1970,
This regime, established under Resolution 1970, will enable us to set up targeted sanctions and implement them against individuals implicated in human trafficking, owing to their responsibility for grave violations of human rights. France will propose to assist the Sanctions Committee, chaired by Sweden, in identifying responsible individuals and entities for trafficking through Libyan territory. We count upon support of the members of the Council to make headway to that end.
Well, people trafficking networks have flourished in Libya since Muammar Gaddafi was deposed and killed 6 years ago. The UN-backed government in Tripoli says it's trying to speed up the deportation of illegal migrants. At the Tariq al-Sika detention centre in the capital, 140 Nigerian migrants were given temporary travel documents on Tuesday before being bussed to the airport. Thousands of others remain imprisoned in detention centres across Libya. Well, let's bring in our guests now. And from Tripoli, Salah Al Bakkush, a Libyan political analyst and a senior advisor to the negotiating team of the High Council of State. In Geneva, Leonard Doyle, he's the spokesman for the International Organisation for Migration. And from Cambridge, via Skype, Rhiannon Smith, managing director of Libya-Analysis, a consultancy organisation specialising in producing reports on Libya. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for being here on Inside Story. Salah, your story. You were kidnapped in Libya not so long ago and afterwards taken to a detention facility. Can you talk us through that whole experience?
Well, this was in this January. I was kidnapped at midnight with some friends, and I was taken that night to a center, was a illegal migrant center. I found that out when they drove us through the gate. There was a big sign, and it's a very well-known facility. We were deposited in a cell that we never left until we escaped 2 months later. But from the cell, from a small window at the top of the door, we can see illegal immigrants going out to the courtyard, washing their clothes, and there were men, women, and children as young as 3 years old. They were playing around, they were washing their clothes and walking around in the sun while we never left the cell until we escaped. This was a detention center. The food was 2 hot meals a day with fruits and juices and drinks. All the furnishings were either marked IOM, USAID, British Embassy, German Embassy, the bedding and the sheets and the blankets. So that was the case there.
You make it sound like the detention centre was of an acceptable standard. Would you agree with that?
I think it was acceptable. However, we hear sometimes, some migrants get beaten. There is no doubt. I mean, nobody in Libya questions the fact that illegal immigrants are badly treated in Libya by smugglers and by inexperienced and untrained staff at these migrant centers.
How did you escape?
Well, we escaped after these gangs were pushed out of their original holdouts to the old Tripoli airport. And when they were attacked again, we were afraid that we're going to get killed in the crossfire. So we escaped, we broke out midnight, and we escaped from Tripoli's airport all the way to Tripoli center.
Just one last question with you, Salah, before I bring in our other guests. Why, when you were rescued from your kidnappers, did you end up in a detention centre for illegal migrants when you yourself are Libyan?
Oh, well, I suppose that some of these centres are run by people who are supposedly legal custodians of the place. They are cooperating with some gangs, or they themselves have two types of work, one governmental and one gangster-like jobs.
Leonard, let's bring you in at this point, because the IOM has been doing a lot of work in these detention centres. As Salah says, it provides mattresses and things for the detainees to use. And yet the organisation is calling for the detention centres to be closed down. Why is that?
There are two types of detention centres. There are the so-called government-run on the one hand, which is what I think your guest is talking about. And then there are lots of others which are being run by militia types and criminals and traffickers. And I think what he's describing is probably right, that there are people who are double jobbing. And this is precisely why we want the migrants to be free, to be taken home, to be voluntarily brought back to their homes, because clearly there's a degree of exploitation taking place. Clearly there is no rule of law in the proper meaning of the term happening. So while the international community is supporting IOM in bringing in humanitarian aid, for example, clean mattresses, for example, food and toiletries and what have you, we need more than that. We need to ensure that when the door closes and we leave, that the place is still safe for migrants and for other Libyans. Because I think another thing that comes out in this interview is that regular Libyans are also being predated upon by criminals and by militia types. And that's as important, if just as important as the migrants, who they have no special status. The problem is rule of law.
And we'll certainly get onto that. The bigger, broader problem in Libya is rule of law or lack of it. Just want to take a step back for a moment, because we are talking about slave markets here in this discussion programme. And Leonard, I know that the IOM has known about this for some time and indeed reported it, but why do you think now it's grabbed the world's attention?
Well, look, I think the problem is that we reported it back in April or May, April of this year, and it did cause a degree of concern, of course it did, and some of our staff were no longer able to work in Libya, and there was a lot of upset at IOM for having done this, because it's quite an accusation to make. In the meantime, journalists from CNN, managed to get in to get video footage. I think what's actually happened is that the broader narrative about migration has gone very toxic. So the fact of leaving your home in a poor West African country and seeking a better life somewhere else is now being seen as a terrible thing to do. You're seen in the Western media in particular as a queue jumper, as an opportunist, as somebody who deserves to be put in detention and sent home. So when people were drowning and when there's stories of migrants in detention, there was limited sympathy for it. I think what happened last week is seeing video footage of people being literally auctioned has taken people aback, and they've given pause to their prejudices about migrants, and they're thinking, my goodness, something that was banned 200 years ago is actually happening in our time, under our watch. Slave auctions. I think that's what's changed, and it's taken this problem to a whole nother level. So the tolerance of the abuse of migrants is now not being tolerated, thank goodness.
Rhiannon, would you agree with that? I mean, 90% of refugees and migrants trying to reach Europe pass through Libya. I mean, that's a huge number of very vulnerable people. Do you think part of the problem has been that there's been limited sympathy for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly the case both in Libya and on the European side. As I think both of your guests have mentioned, the situation in Libya is dire in itself. Libyans themselves are suffering. And, the migrant trade and people passing through Libya, this has been going on for decades. It happened under Gaddafi. It's, increased a lot, and the conditions have arguably got a lot worse. But actually, for a lot of Libyans, the reality is that they're very much concerned with trying to sort their own problems out, their own economy, their own political issues, protecting their own lives. So there is that issue. And then from the European perspective, I think, as again your guest has mentioned, from a European domestic position, the narrative has been overridingly anti-migration, anti-migrant. And therefore, it's only really when you're seeing this kind of video evidence of what does that mean for the people who are stopped from coming to Europe, who are ended up, in these horrific conditions in Libya, what does that mean for them? That then we're sort of starting to see, oh, these are real people, they're suffering through these, horrific conditions. And actually, this is something that, in part, Europe has a part to play for pushing back these migrants, for stopping them from coming to Europe legally or having any sort of recourse to justice, really, when they arrive.
Salah, what role do you see Europe playing in creating these conditions?
The Europeans have to face up to this problem and take some serious action. But trying to subcontract the job to countries in the Mediterranean or other countries that are ill-equipped, they don't have the resources and they don't know what to do. I mean, they have their own problems to deal with. And this puts the migrants at risk. And the European, I mean, look at what Mr. Macron is doing. I mean, 2 weeks ago, they announced a great gesture, taking 25 refugees out of over 40,000 in government centers in Libya. I mean, and then Mr. Macron talks about, maybe setting up hot spots or whatever they call them in Libya to process immigrants. And these type of Band-Aid solutions are not going to work.
Leonard, he's right, isn't he? I mean, if we look at reports, we've got Italy as an example, a report, should I say, of Italy paying militias inside Libya to deter migrants from getting on the boats and making their way to Europe, thereby creating a backlog of people who are extremely vulnerable to being abused by people traffickers and smugglers and criminal gangs.
I think that's really quite naive, if you don't mind my saying so. The notion that any country in the world should facilitate irregular migrant to its shores. I mean, for goodness sakes, look at the political reaction that's happening in Europe to the large numbers of economic migrants who've been coming through without passports, without going through the proper visa processes. What your guest has said is right. The visa processes, the capacity of Europe, or the willingness of Europe to accept people legally, is appallingly weak. Legal pathways need to be created. But that does not mean that one has to open one's doors and bring everybody in. Because the obvious reason is that communities are feeling, whether rightly or wrongly, feeling overwhelmed, and they're starting to vote extreme right. Do we want to see fascism return to Europe? I hope not. So there has to be managed migration. I mean, that's the whole point. This notion that you have open borders is for the birds. If you have nation states, you have to manage the borders. We have to obviously allow for circular migration. If there are harvests to be gathered in Europe, and if migrants wish to come and do that work and return, of course, it's a really good thing to do, because guess what? Most migrants don't want to live in northern climates where the food is bad and the climate is worse. They want to live with their own communities, but they'd like to be able to go and work, and they work so hard, and bring the resource back. That's Europe's problem right there, creating circular migration. But let's not blame Europe for the crimes of individual human beings in Libya. For goodness sakes, they're not the ones who are running the slave auctions. That is the criminal act that's happening.
Rhiannon, what's your thoughts on that? Because we do have the UN Human Rights Chief saying that Europe's policy of helping Libyan authorities intercept migrants and refugees and return them to prisons is inhumane.
Yes, I would agree with that. And although I agree with your other guests in terms of course, having open borders and all the rest of it, of course, there has to be limits on that. But equally, what we've seen happen in Libya in the last months over the summer is the Italians and others actively supporting militias on the ground to turn back migrants, I apologise, often even when they're in international waters, which goes against international humanitarian law from that perspective, but also knowingly that they are turning them back to these conditions that we're now seeing in these videos, to the detention centres. Often they're not even government run, they're just being held by a militia, no recourse to justice, rape, torture, all of these, awful reports that we're hearing. And I think there is a degree of responsibility on the European nations, not specifically, the southern Mediterranean ones. I think this should be at an EU level, and in terms of how Europe as a whole accepts how they deal with illegal migration, and also trying to make more legal migration, again, as your other guests have said. But, I think that there is a degree of responsibility there. And actually what we've seen since the numbers have been cut down, so the migrants have been turned back, which we've seen increasingly since the summer, that's often when more and more of these reports are coming, because what's happening is all the migrants that have been turned back are now concentrated in a lot of these coastal areas in Western Libya, which is leading to more overcrowding, more issues, which, against the backdrop of economic crisis and the conflict ongoing in Libya, is a recipe for humanitarian disaster.
Salah, we have two different opinions here. Where do people in Libya place the blame for this situation?
Libyans in Libya are more aware of the history of the continent than your guest. Yes, these people that are supposedly selling other people are criminals, but the criminality really is the colonization of Africa, the rape of its resources by the Europeans, and their long-time support of despotic regimes in Africa. Otherwise, these people may not ever have tried to go to Europe, and they could have stayed in their countries. That's the real criminal act. And now Europe has to face up to this stuff and cannot say, well, I cannot accept everybody, and the criminals are the Libyans or the Tunisians or the Turks. That's the real criminal act, and that's what the root cause of this problem is. Lack of development.
Let's just take a quick step back here and take a look at how we got here. We've got Libya's revolution quickly going from peaceful protests to armed conflict. On the 19th of March 2011, the United Nations Security Council voted to impose a no-fly zone over Libya. French jets began bombing Libya just hours after the resolution was passed. In September, a conference was held in Paris to discuss reshaping Libya. Muammar Gaddafi urged his supporters to fight on. Mahmoud Jibril, the interim Prime Minister, arrived in Tripoli as part of the new interim government called the National Transition Council. Nicolas Sarkozy, the then French President, and David Cameron, the then British Prime Minister, landed in Libya to a hero's welcome. Mustafa Abdul Jalil, the leader of the National Transitional Council, declared Libya liberated 8 months after the uprising against Muammar Gaddafi began. Leonard, when we look at that timeline, we can see that France, Europe were the lead agents in the downfall of Gaddafi. So surely there should be some bearing of responsibility for the state that Libya is in today.
I mean, are you actually suggesting that they should have propped up that dictator? Is that what the suggestion? Because I think that would be, farcical. And let me just return to some of the points made, some of which I thought were excellent. But let's just ask the question, do we really think it's a good idea for people who've never even been to sea before to be put to water in rubber dinghies that are way over capacity? Is that a good idea? Is that not sending them to their doom? That's the first question. And the second question is, blaming us today, blaming the world today for the problems of West Africa. Sure, it's right. The analysis of your guest is right. That's a historical issue. We have to talk about horrible, depraved acts against living human beings today that have been videotaped, where people are being auctioned. I mean, let's focus on what's happening now and how to fix that. Of course, the points he made are right about the post-colonial era.
It's a fair point.
One other point
let's focus on that and how to fix that. No, how do we then fix the situation that we're looking at today? You have first-hand knowledge of this. How do we fix it?
Well, I think what we're seeing is finally, because it's broken through the barrier, if you like, and people are taking it very seriously, you see a unity, finally, between the African Union and the European Union. So rather than having arguments about colonialism, they're saying, how can we fix it? And the plan that we've put to them is, let us evacuate voluntarily. Let us take home people who want to leave from that detention centre that your guest described so well. Because when my colleague was there the other day, the people were crammed into the detention centre, one of the same ones, desperately asking, requesting to be brought home. That would help a lot, because that would take some of the kind of underpinning of the smugglers' market away. They're obviously profiting from human beings. Let's take these human beings out of the picture. But that's not the only thing. Why are people coming into Libya? They're coming into Libya because they're seeing a dream of Europe on their phones. They're seeing it on Facebook. They're seeing it on social media. Smugglers are allowed to create a business page which promises a lie. So why do the big tech companies not support and help correct the fake news that's bringing so many young Africans, young impressionable people, to their doom?
Okay,
I mean, I think
so
there are
is
many,
work to be
many
done
people who
in
can
the
help in
countries
this.
of
It's not
origins.
just...
Okay,
Yep.
I get your point. Salah, if we look at another option that is on the table, it comes from the Libyan ambassador. He's saying that he will pursue these criminals, i.e. the people traffickers, and bring them to justice. But I'm wondering just how likely that is, how easy it is to find them. Do you know, for example, who kidnapped you?
Well, I agree with your guest that we have to have a complete solution, integrated solution. I mean, it starts with an educational campaign to these potential migrants. We need development in the countries that send these migrants, and we also need to stop the supply of migrants to these gangs that are dealing in this illegal immigration and slavery, modern slavery. We have to have a complete solution, but all the countries have to participate in this. And just laying the blame on the Libyans. The Libyan government is having a hard time governing, delivering basic services, medicine and food to its citizens. Trying to, depending on the Libyan government is not going to be a solution. We have to have an integrated solution that has participation from everybody.
OK. Rhiannon, how does that happen? How do we get an integrated solution in Libya when we don't really even know who's in power?
I mean, that's a difficulty that I think Salah has highlighted there, that the Libyan government or governments, the sort of three still competing governments, the UN peace process is ongoing. No one is really, in direct control. There's a lot of militias that are running the roost in a lot of areas. So I think that is a difficulty because who do you work with? Who actually has the power to, for example, go into these detention centres and improve conditions? Who has the ability or the capacity to take someone to trial or run an investigation? It's really not clear, and that isn't really the priority. And, there's so many other things going on that's unlikely to happen. So, I mean, I can see a situation where there would be, as some of your other guests have mentioned, increased support, international support for voluntary repatriation. Again, this campaign of communication in the origin countries, but also in Libya. I think there's other things that can be done. I mean, from one side, it's really getting behind solving the Libyan problem in terms of the Libyan political solution. That's ongoing, but it's stalled. There are still many problems there. So one is really international countries in the region and Europe getting behind that and really pushing the Libyans to come to some kind of unity agreement. The other one is the economy, because, of course, a lot of these smugglers, they're making money and all the rest of it, but a lot of them arguably wouldn't be in that situation. They wouldn't be turning to smuggling or criminality if the Libyan economy was back on its feet. And at the moment, people can't get cash out of the banks. The dinar value has plummeted. People aren't getting salary. There's all these things that are going on in the background.
Okay.
And I think that's an area that also could be supported by a unified international effort.
Absolutely fascinating discussion, and thank you all very much for joining us to take part in it today. Salah Al Bakkush, Leonard Doyle and Rhiannon Smith. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.